Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're taking on some source material that is, let's just say it's as politically charged as it is theological.
That's putting it lightly.
The documents you've shared with us come from May of 1977. Specifically, we're looking at a major address by Sun Myung Moon at Belvedere, New York. It's titled Defining Dominion, God, Man, and World Unity.
And this is a really high-stakes deep dive. Our whole mission here is to unpack a worldview that, well, it doesn't just analyze the global chaos of the late 70s.
No, it radically condemns both communism and Western democracy as total failures.
Exactly. And then it proposes this extremely centralized and, let's be honest, very controversial solution for how to achieve global unity.
It really sets the stage immediately with this fundamental problem of ownership. The address notes that every person, every family, every nation is driven by this ambition to possess the good and, dominate the bad.
But then it pivots. Before we can even get to who should own the world, the speaker hits you with the core question.
Who possesses man?
That's the key. That is the lever this entire worldview operates on. Man wants to dominate creation, sure, but what's the nature of his ownership?
So you have the free world on one side with individual ownership and liberty.
Right. And the communist world on the other with state or party ownership. But the argument is that neither system is asking the right question about their ultimate sovereignty. Man is supreme in the physical world. The world should belong to man, but only. And this is the big catch.
Only if that system is God-centered, has an eternal foundation.
Precisely. And that idea leads directly to the most jarring concept we're going to talk about.
Heavenly totalitarianism.
Heavenly totalitarianism centered on God. And if that's the solution, it naturally implies that democracy as we know it is just a transitional ideology.
That phrase alone, heavenly totalitarianism, it's designed to make you stop and think.
It forces you to confront the failure of human-centered political systems. The whole argument is, if God is the source of all value and truth, then the structure that embodies that absolute truth must be absolute.
But, and this is the part we'll have to unpack, unlike earthly totalitarianism, it supposedly can't violate the inherent dignity of man. How those two ideas can coexist.
Yeah.
That's the puzzle.
That's a huge puzzle.
So let's start with the diagnosis of failure. The source material lays out this global clash between two ideologies that just can't coexist.
Right. You have the individualistic free world, which allows religion, private ownership.
Versus the state-controlled communist world where the party defines all value and religion is denied.
And the diagnosis is, like you said before, swift and devastating. The speaker just asserts that these two clashing ideologies, they're both crumbling.
Even as they're spreading their influence.
Exactly. Even then, they each contain their own internal contradictions that basically guarantee they're going to fail.
Okay, so how does the source justify the failure of the communist model specifically?
Well, it comes back down to that question of temporal versus eternal power. Communism, he argues, it fundamentally conflicts with man's dignity because it enslaves the individual to the temporal state, to the party.
A man's value is just determined by his loyalty.
Right, and he can be sacrificed for the party's sake at any moment. But the source points out the critical flaw in that whole assumption of party supremacy. You have to ask, is any communist party eternal? Does it have the authority of an eternal power? And the answer is no. The party is temporal. It's always changing.
So any rights you get from it are inherently unstable.
Exactly. It's a violation of human dignity. The individual just becomes a cog in a machine that could change direction tomorrow.
The address uses the Berlin Wall as a really stark illustration of this. I mean, for 1977, that's incredibly timely.
A powerful illustration. The argument is, if that oppressive barrier wasn't there, the East German people would just flood to the West. The wall itself is proof that the system crushes human rights.
So if communism were based on some unchanging truth, it wouldn't need walls.
It wouldn't need walls to keep its people in, but it chooses enslavement instead.
Okay, so that's the communist failure. What about the other side? What's the inherent flaw in the free world system, the one built on individualism?
Well, the free world recognizes the value of the individual, but it has this massive vulnerability. The address argues that pure individualism, if it's not anchored by a religious standard, will inevitably crash into a stone wall.
A stone wall of selfishness and greed.
Right. Without that, eternal compass of God's will, individual liberty just devolves into libertinism, and the whole society becomes internally vulnerable, corruptible.
And this failure to properly manage individualism is what leads directly to the condemnation of America.
It does. Let's get into America's role because the accusations are incredibly sharp.
The address says America was motivated by a mix of national ambition and trying to fulfill God's desires, but it failed at both. The image he uses is that America is stopping in the middle of the street.
It's a very harsh judgment. He's saying America had the chance to be the global champion, but its focus on materialism, on extreme individualism, left it spiritually weak. It just couldn't execute the full mission. And when you stop in the middle of the street...
You're just an obstruction to everyone.
Exactly. And the most potent part of this is the specific accusation of betrayal in foreign policy.
Southeast Asia, Vietnam and Cambodia.
Yes. The address singles out America's half-hearted involvement. The argument is that millions of innocent people in those regions cooperated with the U.S. They put their faith, their lives on the line for the free world ideal.
And then America just left.
He says America decided to turn and walk out, and these people were left completely unprotected, subsequently murdered or, suffered tremendously under these retaliatory regimes.
So the failure wasn't just losing a war. It was the moral abandonment of its allies. It's an indictment of American character.
It is. The source presents this as a complete rupture of trust. By acting halfway, America didn't just fail politically, it became the enemy of both sides. Hated by the communists, sure, but also hated by those former free world nations that depended on it.
He calls that a realistic picture of today's world situation. America, isolated by its own moral failure.
And internally, that same lack of a center makes the U.S. vulnerable. The source sees this internal division growing, all because of extreme individualism. And this is where he brings in the idea of communistic Christianity.
Or Marxist Christianity.
Yes. The address claims this is just a logical consequence. If Christianity, which was supposed to be the spiritual anchor for America, failed to uphold God's vision, then the forces of Satan will create an imitation.
An ideology that mimics the goal of unification, but it's rooted in materialism and earthly politics.
The failure of the champion necessitates the rise of the counterfeit.
Which sets up this really radical theological justification. I mean, you have this colossal failure by America, the nation supposedly chosen by God. How does the address explain the spread of communism, a godless ideology, in a world supposedly guided by divine providence?
It's a profound shift in perspective. The argument is that God allowed communism to spread.
Allowed it.
Yes. He saw it as a necessary evil, or maybe more accurately, as a template. If America failed to meet expectations, the outcome had to be failure. But God uses that failure to teach the world a lesson.
And the lesson is?
That all mankind should eventually belong to one single unified ideology, just one that's centered on God, not the temporal state.
So communism is seen as a crude, like a political prototype for unification, a secular totalitarian framework that God will ultimately use, but just swap out the state and put himself at the center.
That is the core claim. So the difference between God's goal and Satan's goal isn't the end result, which is a unified world under one ideology.
It's the center.
It's the center. Satan is advancing political totalitarianism and materialism to build this unified world, but without God. It's an explicit imitation that leverages that human desire for global unity.
This inherent danger then leads to an absolutely chilling warning.
Oh, the stakes are portrayed as immediate, existential. The speaker warns that if the free world fails to mobilize, fails to stop this trend, God will be compelled to permit communism to rule first.
And the consequences laid out with shocking specificity. If communism takes over the entire world, at least 1/3 of the world population, especially the white population, will be obliterated.
1/3 of the population.
I mean, that's an astonishing figure to just project like that. How on earth does the address justify that specific number?
It cites historical precedent. It references Chairman Mao and the liquidation of, 25% of his own people in China?
So the implication is that the very nature of communism, which puts the party above the individual, it inherently leads to mass liquidation when it gets total control.
Yes. The warning is designed to shock you into immediate action, to treat this ideology as a literal life or death threat that demands a total restructuring of global politics before 1978.
That sense of imminent crisis brings us back to the solution then, this God-centered theocracy, or as he called it, heavenly totalitarianism, a new world order that must totally replace humanism and materialism.
And to achieve this, you have to challenge America's foundational political structures. The address explicitly rejects the separation of religion and government,
calling it a most effective tactic of Satan.
Right.
Okay, help me understand the reasoning there. We tend to view the separation of church and state as a protection, right? Of freedom, of minority rights. Why does the address see it as satanic?
Because, in this view, it creates a deliberate communication block between God and the civil authorities. If God is the ultimate eternal source of truth and the government is supposed to enact that truth,
Then separating them ensures the government will always be temporal, fallible, humanistic.
exactly, just the kind of failing system they criticized earlier. God's plan, according to the source, is that national leaders, presidents, Congress, should be recognized by God first and then given the mission to govern.
Which introduces this fundamental political paradox. I mean, if leaders are recognized by God first and governing is based on eternal truth, that sounds like absolute authority.
It does.
But the source insists that under this God-centered totalitarianism, the democratic rights of the individual will never be violated. How do you square that circle? How can you have absolute God-centered rule and still promise to protect individual rights?
That's the crucial distinction, the heavenly version versus the earthly, secular ones. Earthly totalitarianism, like communism, violates rights because the center is temporal and selfish. It's the party or the dictator.
And because the center is flawed, its rule has to be enforced through violence and coercion.
Crushing dissent. But in the heavenly version, because the center God is defined as eternal, selfless love and unchanging truth, the authority from that center inherently promotes universal welfare and the dignity of the individual.
So true individual rights are only secure when they're based on an eternal standard, not the shifting whims of political parties.
That's the argument, which places the unification movement at the center of this titanic struggle. Their mission is to transcend sectarianism, racism, and promote the specific model.
They have to become stronger, spiritually and functionally, than the communists.
And the source claims communist leaders know the speaker is their only serious threat. The opposition is seen as organized, deliberate, even reaching into media institutions.
The specificity of that is fascinating. The address mentions the Washington Post refusing to run a patriotic ad from the movement in 1976.
While at the same time running full-page ads from Kim Il-sung over and over again.
Wow.
That example is used to illustrate a broader conspiracy. The source argues that communists are actively manipulating the media and government agencies to undermine the movement because they recognize this new ideology as the only real opponent to their goal of global materialist unification.
So if the stakes are this high global obliteration versus global spiritual sovereignty, what is the cost required of the individual adherent to succeed? This must be where the principle of indemnity comes in.
Indemnity is the pathway for restoration, and it demands absolute sacrifice. The individual has to return everything they possess, even the money in your pocket, back to God and mankind.
But it's not a loss, it's an investment.
Exactly. By making this selfless condition, you can then receive God's entire kingdom back, permanently. You possess it forever with God.
And the address then uses the speaker's own personal suffering to set the bar for this commitment. These aren't just general hardships, they're incredibly vivid.
Oh, yes. The goal is to set a complete condition of indemnity, starting from absolute zero. He recounts eating near a honey bucket, an open human waste receptacle, and using his hands as silverware.
He marked his birthdays by fasting for 3 years.
3 years, consecutively. He even makes a point of noting that the suit he was wearing during the address was bought for $49 because he'd only worn old military or secondhand clothes until he was 30.
So these sacrifices are the necessary spiritual currency for restoration. But the true scope of the mission, it goes beyond just earthly politics and personal sacrifice. It moves into the invisible mission.
This is where the deep dive gets really compelling.
The spirit world.
Yes. The address reveals that all these seemingly external things, starting a newspaper, sponsoring political conferences, visiting Las Vegas, even engaging with someone like President Nixon, they aren't the end goal.
They're physical actions for the sake of liberating the spirit world.
Liberating the spirit world.
So, how does that work? How does running an ad campaign connect to liberating spirits?
The source explains that by succeeding here on Earth, the movement creates the necessary conditions for repentance and liberation for those in the spirit world, especially for people who failed in their earthly missions, media professionals, politicians.
So once those spirits are liberated and repentant, they join the fight from the other side.
Precisely. They are then able to assist the movement on Earth. The goal is for these now aligned spirits to, and this is a quote, brainwash the editors-in-chief of the world to advance God's ideal.
Wow. So the political and media battles we see are just the surface. They're manifestations of a much larger spiritual war.
The physical actions provide the leverage for the spirit world to influence the decision makers on Earth.
That completely recontextualizes the nature of the struggle. The ultimate fight isn't just in Washington or Moscow, it's across dimensions, with the spirit world acting as this vast, invisible intelligence network.
And that leads to the final requirement for followers. This moment in time, he says, demands an adventurous leap forward. Adherents must be willing to lose their lives for the sake of the world, gambling everything on God, mankind, and all things at once.
And he declares this is the most critical time of history is passing now before 1978. There's no time to wait. Dedication must be total and immediate.
No time for stagnation.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize this huge, sweeping vision. We've unpacked a worldview that demands absolute peace, universal charity, and the end of human greed.
Yet insists these goals have to be achieved through a highly centralized, God-centered political structure, a heavenly totalitarianism.
The tension is still so profound. You have this explicit rejection of liberal democracy and humanism as failed systems,
Countered by the insistence that the individual rights championed by the free world will somehow be made eternal and inviolable under this new absolute sovereignty.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the source material is explicit. Democracy is only a transitional ideology.
It's a stage to pass through, not the final destination.
Which really raises an important question for you, for anyone listening.
Right. If knowledge, choice, and freedom are championed as the highest values in our current society, what happens when a powerful ideology insists those values are insufficient, that they must be transcended or even sacrificed, gambled, for the sake of a superior, unified, eternal, global goal?
What does that perspective imply about the future sustainability of all human-centered political systems?
A truly challenging perspective on sovereignty and sacrifice.
Thank you for diving into these provocative sources with us. It really makes you consider what you would be willing to gamble for the sake of global unity after processing that deep dive. We'll see you next time.